Church, if you would get your Old Testament out, turn to Genesis chapter 34. Get a bulletin, turn it over. We'll take a few notes as we go along this morning. Genesis chapter 34. Do you ever have one of those days where it starts out bad? And then it gets worse? I hope you never have another one, but sometimes that happens, doesn't it? Starts out bad, and it gets worse. Let's look at this text together. Genesis 34, verse 1. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, had born to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land. When Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the ruler of that area, saw her, he took her and he violated her. That's the 1984 NIV. The more updated 2011 edition of the NIV simply says he took her and he raped her. And that's the idea. Dinah goes out into this land where they live as strangers. They're outsiders. She and her family. Jacob is her dad. She's got 11 brothers. And because she goes out on her own, she finds herself in a compromised position and she's raped. Was she naive? Was she rebellious? Was she just plain ignorant of the ways of the world? The text doesn't tell us. But the text of Genesis chapter 34 never blames Dinah for what happened. That much is clear. Nevertheless, it's impossible to look at this text without asking the question, was she foolish? Naomi, many years after this, would tell Ruth, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the other girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." Sometimes we do things that may not be morally incorrect, but they could be foolish and naive. New York Magazine came out recently with a suggestion to try to help with something that has become a concern in the news recently. It's the increased number of rapes on college campuses across our land. And this particular solution caught my eye. It's unique, if nothing else. New York Magazine has suggested that we could help out the rape situation on college campuses by encouraging college students to smoke more pot. That's one of those things when I read that it causes me to ask myself, where am I? Where do I live? What kind of world do I find myself in? Now, they also said that it would probably be good to raise taxes on alcohol consumption. Don't stop it. Don't encourage people not to drink. Just raise taxes on it. But get them to smoke more pot. That'll mellow them out. Maybe they won't rape anybody. Harvard School of Public Health did a survey and found out that 72% of the people who are raped on campus are inebriated. Did they put themselves in a poor situation? Our culture is struggling with this. Now, campuses and legislators across the land are passing laws. California passed a law called the Yes Means Yes law. In other words, they're trying to define and dictate what it means to say yes to somebody else so that you can engage in sexual activity. Student activists in California insist that children from K through 12 need to be taught about these consent laws. Now, understandably, some parents, and I hope you would be in this group, are upset with the idea that in school their children are going to be taught as young as 5 and 6 and 7 years old what they have to do to say yes to somebody else so that they can engage in sexual activity. I have another suggestion. Instead of yes means yes, I have a suggestion, and I call it the M&M solution, okay? And I'm not talking about the wrapper, and I'm not talking about the candy. The M&M solution. Here's what it is. The first M stands for modesty. Why don't we learn how to dress again? The second M stands for marriage. Why don't we encourage people to wait until they're married to have sex again? So we can go with the yes means yes, or we can go with the M&M. I suggest we go with modesty and marriage. Do you think that might cut down on the number of rapes on college campuses in our culture? Well, what about Dinah? Here's the first thing I'd like you to write down on your outline this morning. Did Dinah make a mistake? Commentators struggle with this. Commentators struggle with this, and there's no real definitive answer other than the fact that the text never blames Dinah for what happened to her. And that's pretty loud to me, but here, we'll give this answer. Did Dinah make a mistake? Maybe. Maybe. But she did not deserve to be raped. That's the answer that I give to that. Maybe she made a mistake, I don't know, but she didn't deserve to be raped. Let's go on, verse 3. His heart, Hamor, the rapist, was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. And he loved the girl, and he spoke tenderly to her. And Shechem said to his father, Hamor, get me this girl as my wife. Now, in the ancient Near Eastern world, parents arranged marriages. And so after he's raped Dinah, he wants to marry her, and he asks his father to get her. He's a little coarse in his discourse. There's no please, and he calls her this girl, and you wonder if he even knows what her name is at this point. And another thing that's troubling in this particular episode is at this point, Hamor doesn't rebuke his son, Shechem, for raping this girl, Dinah. He never does. Did Shechem hide that fact from Hamor? I don't know. There's a lot of unknowns in this text. It's a troubling text, and we're just getting started. This is the bad. Now we're going to get the worse. Verse 5, when Jacob heard that his daughter Dinah had been defiled, his sons were in the fields with his livestock, so he kept quiet about it until they came home. Now, I don't know about you, I expect that when a father hears that his daughter has been raped, that he would be fiercely angry and outraged. And so I'm stunned when I come to this verse and I hear that Jacob is simply quiet about it. Now, the narrator tells us that he's quiet because his sons are away in the fields, and perhaps he feels like he needs their support. I don't know, but still, I'm troubled by that. Some people say he was being prudent, because the person who raped his daughter was a man of influence and power politically and locally, and he had to be careful how he stepped. Well, I don't know. That doesn't persuade me too much. It does some. Verse 6, then Shechem's father, Hamor, went out to talk with Jacob. Well, he ought to. Verse 7, now Jacob's sons had come in from the fields as soon as they heard what had happened. They were filled with grief and fury. This is what I expected from Dad. At least we get it from the brothers. Because Shechem had done a disgraceful thing in Israel. That's interesting, in Israel. Because we're still a family and not a nation. Remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel by God. But already, they're beginning to have this sense of identity. A disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. In other words, by having sex with her, by raping her, a thing that should not be done. Amen to that. A thing that should not be done. Verse 8, but Hamor said to them, my son Shechem has his heart set on your daughter. Please give her to him as his wife. Intermarry with us. Give us your daughters and take our daughters for yourselves. You can settle among us. The land is open to you. Live in it, trade in it, and acquire property in it. Now notice, secondarily, what we learn from this is that Jacob's family is in an outsider situation in this town, in this culture, this region. They're not considered to be insiders. And now what Hamor is saying is, we will consider you to be insiders. We want to invite you in. We now want to intermarry with you. We want to do business with you. You can be just like everyone else. And he's offering them the opportunity, apparently, to overlook the indiscretions of his overly passionate young man, his son. No reference to the rape, no apology. It's just, let's pretend it never happened. Then verse 11, Shechem jumps in, and he said to Dinah's father and brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and I will give you whatever you ask. Make the price for the bride and the gift I'm to bring as great as you like, and I'll pay whatever you ask me. Only give me the girl as my wife." Now, in the ancient Near East, it was proper for the parents to come and offer a bride price, a dowry, and there was money that changed hands and so forth. And that's what he appears to be referring to, that there's sort of a sinister undercurrent here, because there's no apology, there's no remorse, there's no contrition, there's no repentance. There's just this, you ask me what I need to give you. Make it as big as you want, and I'll give it to you. And the implication is that he's trying to buy them off. Just take my money and be quiet about the way this thing started, and we'll smooth it out, and we'll move on. Now, commentators are confused here too. They're confused by Dinah. Was she complicit? They're confused by Hamor and Shechem. Are they really trying to do the right thing? Here's the second thing on your outline today. Was Shechem trying to do right? At least he was willing to marry the girl. Yeah, but there's just some troubling aspects to this. Very unsettling. In addition to the rape. Was Shechem trying to do right? Maybe. Maybe. But he should have repented. He should have apologized. He should have got down on his knees, first of all to God, and then to Dinah, and then to the brothers and the father and the rest of the family, and said, "I've done a horrible thing. I'm sorry. Is there any way you can find in your heart to forgive me?" But he comes boldly and brashly in with all of his money and his local influence and tries to buy himself into a position where everyone just overlooks what he has done. Was Shechem trying to do right? Maybe, but he should have repented. Verse 13, let's see what happens next. Because their sister Dinah had been defiled, Jacob's sons replied deceitfully as they spoke to Shechem and his father Hamor. Do you see how bad it's starting to get worse here? They spoke deceitfully. First of all, we ask ourselves, why didn't Jacob answer? Why are the brothers taking over here? He's the patriarch of the family. He's supposed to be the spiritual leader of the family. He's sitting in the background, apparently silent. And the narrator gives us a clue here that things are not as they seem. When it says that they answered deceitfully. The narrator wants us, as we listen to what the brothers say in this ensuing negotiation, the narrator wants us to know something's not right here. Something is going to go wrong. Verse 14, they said to them, the brothers said to Hamor and Shechem, "We can't do such a thing. We cannot intermarry with you." In other words, we can't give our sister to a man who is not circumcised. That would be a disgrace to us. This should have been a warning right here to Hamor and Shechem that these young men, Dinah's sisters, are far more interested in her honor than they are in economic benefits. Verse 15, "We will give our consent to you on one condition only, that you become like us by circumcising all your males. Then we will give you our daughters and take your daughters for ourselves. We'll settle among you and become one people with you." Notice they never mention the money. They never mention the property or any of that. Hamor is focused on the economic end. He thinks that he can buy off this family, and they'll forget what his son has done to their daughter. But the brothers are saying that this isn't about money. This is about our sister's honor. This is about what your son did to Dinah. Now remember, circumcision, it was not unknown in the ancient Near Eastern world. A lot of people circumcised their males, but God gave circumcision to Abraham and to the Israelites as a special sign that they belonged to him. And so what the brothers are doing here is they're using a religious symbol deceitfully. They're using a religious symbol. They're using their religion, their faith, to fool someone else. The more we go along in this story, the darker, the more troubling, the more unsettling, and the more difficult it gets. Bad goes to worse. God's people were told throughout the Old Testament, be very careful who you marry. If you marry into an unbelieving, pagan, idolatrous people or family, then that's going to end up being something that causes compromise in your own spiritual life. And so very early they were taught and they internalized this idea that we are separate people. We're different. We're different. But Jacob's sons are using this idea in a very deceitful and troubling way here. Verse 17, they finish up by saying, but if you will not agree to be circumcised, we'll take our sister and go. Now there's a veiled thread in here that really we don't know about yet. Maybe I shouldn't mention it, but when you've read the story over and over again, you learn later on, just a few verses from here, that Dinah was still in Hamor's house. He raped her, and he took her home. And he kept her there. And so all of this negotiation is going on between the brothers and the rapist while she is in his house. He's got the upper hand. And when they say to them, either you do it our way or we'll take our sister and go, that's a threat that they're going to come into town and take their sister away from them. Whether or not Hamor and Shechem took it seriously, apparently they didn't. Apparently they thought they were in pretty good shape. Verse 18. Their proposal seemed good to Hamor and to his son Shechem. They probably saw the circumcision as just a marriage rite, which is what it was for many peoples in the ancient Near Eastern world. Verse 19, the young man who was most honored of all his father's household, if a rapist is the most honored in a household, that household's got some problems. Lost no time in doing what they said because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. Verse 20, so Hamor and his son Shechem went to the gate of their city to speak to their fellow townsmen. Now the gate of the ancient Near Eastern city is kind of like the courthouse today. That's where all the important business took place. Verse 21, here's what they said. These men, speaking of Jacob and his family, these men are friendly toward us. Oh, little did he know. Let them live in our land and trade in it. The land has plenty of room for them. We can marry their daughters, they can marry ours. But the men will consent to live with us as one people on only one condition, that our males be circumcised as they themselves are. Won't their livestock, their property, and all their other animals become ours? So let's give our consent to them, and they'll settle among us. Notice what they never mention. They never really tell the people of the city what's going on. They're being dishonest. What's really going on is he's trying to work things out for his son to get past this rape issue and get this girl for him. None of that's mentioned. It's all couched in economic terms. Hey, let's get together with these people. Let's invite them in to be a part of our city, and we'll gain from it economically. They are being deceived by Jacob's sons, and they themselves are deceived. There's very little truth going on here. Very little truth. Verse 24, all the men who went out of the city at the gate agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male in the city was circumcised. Either they're very eager for the economic gain, or they're not willing to go against Shechem and Hamor. We don't know which one. The important point for the narrative is that they agree. And so they go home, they circumcise themselves, or get circumcised. Verse 25, 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, crudely performed, circumcision could be quite incapacitating. So these guys were in poor shape on the third day here. Verse 25, 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi. Simeon and Levi are full brothers of Dinah. Remember, Jacob had been tricked into his father-in-law into marrying sisters. And then he also had children by each of the sisters' handmaidens. So he has children. He has children by 4 women. And Dinah is Leah's daughter, and Simeon and Levi are also Leah's sons, and so they're full brothers. They're not the only two, but they're two. Verse 25, 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, we should read that, full brothers, took their swords, attacked the unsuspecting city, and killed every male. How far down is this thing going to go? It's just amazing how rapidly this story unfolds. Darker darker, wickeder, more violent and more violent. One act of violence sparks these events, and it's like a domino that just pushes everything down. It's unfortunate that life is that way, isn't it, sometimes? One of these things starts, and it just cries out for some righteous person to stand up and stop it before it turns into one of these. And when nobody does, this is what happens. This is what happens. Killing every male. Verse 26. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword and took Dinah from Shechem's house and left. This is where we learn that Dinah was there. So they're coming back into town to take her home, even though they made the agreement with them that they wouldn't do that. And the narrator wants us to understand that they did kill Hamor and Shechem. The question is, why kill everyone in town? That seems a little heavy-handed, doesn't it? You can almost understand why he would kill Shechem and Hamor, because Hamor would seem to be complicit in all of this by trying to cover it up. But to kill every male in town, what is the point of that? Commentators give two possible reasons. Logically, one reason might be that they saw the entire town as being guilty because they didn't do anything about it either. But we don't know whether the men in town knew about the rape or not. The other reason is that they were being careful. You know, in the ancient Near Eastern world, if you killed somebody, you better be careful. If you kill him, you better do what? If he's got his sons, first of all, you better be sure to kill his sons, because what's going to happen? They're going to be gunning for you. In fact, if you leave anybody in his family alive, then you're probably in danger. So if you're going to kill somebody, if you're going to assassinate somebody, that's why if you've read the Old Testament, you read through the places where leaders get assassinated and they wipe the whole family out, you're thinking, my goodness, why did they do that? Well, they do it for a reason. Not saying that it's good, it's not, but it's practical if you want to stay alive. And in this particular case, maybe they thought that they needed to kill every man in town to protect themselves and their own family. It doesn't make it right. But the Bible doesn't tell us why they were so heavy-handed. Verse 27, the sons of Jacob came upon the dead bodies and looted the city where their sister had been defiled. They seized their flocks and their herds and their donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried off all their wealth, all their women and their children, taking plunder, everything in the house. They even enslaved the women and the children. Dark. Wicked. Can I say overkill? You know, you can have some sympathy for these brothers and their outrage over what happened to their sister, but their dishonesty, their abuse of the religious symbol, the covenant symbol, their making an agreement and then breaking it, their overreaction. The narrator just seems to want us to be pulled both ways with almost everybody in the story. So like with Shechem, he wanted to marry her, he's trying to do right, but he raped her. He's not all bad, he's not all good. Nobody in this narrative comes out smelling like a rose. Everyone is struggling. Did Dinah's brothers overreact? Well, back in the 1800s in West Virginia and in Kentucky, there were two families. They got crossways with each other. And they started killing each other. West Virginia, Kentucky, two families. They started picking off, mostly the males, out in the woods with their rifles. Catch somebody from the other family. And even if it was someone who by himself was innocent, just because he had a certain last name, he was gone. Anybody remember those two families? They're infamous, aren't they? The Hatfields and the McCoys. They were real. It seems almost cartoonish to us now at this point, but those families really existed, and they really did slaughter each other for years. For years. It was a blood feud. It was a blood feud. Now, this is what, by the way, the Bible is talking about when God gives Moses the law. He gives him something that theologians now call the lex talionis. The lex talionis. We know it more popularly by the way that it's in the Bible. An eye, what? And for a tooth, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. A lot of people read that in modern times and they go, "That's brutal. That's horrible. God must be a terrible God." But God was giving the lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, to people like the Hatfields and the McCoys. And what he was saying is, when somebody does you wrong, yes, you deserve justice, but you don't deserve to go in and wipe out an entire family or an entire tribe or an entire town for what one person did. That's not justice. And that's where eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth comes in. It was actually a limiting factor legally in the context in which it was given. The brothers here, do they want justice? Is the next question on your outline. Let's write this down. Did Dinah's brothers want justice? Probably. Probably. But instead, they took revenge. Revenge. Revenge is a dangerous game, and it's not the same as justice. Revenge is taken outside of the system of justice, and it often is itself unjust. And the brothers got swept away. Verse 30, then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, finally the man speaks. Where has he been all this time? Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, then, after this thing has turned into an absolute, horrible, bloody, terrible, dark mess, finally the man stands up and says something. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have brought trouble on me. You have brought trouble on me. Well, where were you, Jacob? You have brought trouble on me by making me a stench to the Canaanites and the Perizzites. The people living in this land, we're few in number. And if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed. What's he worried about? Is he concerned about justice? Is he concerned about the honor of his daughter, Dinah? Is he concerned about what happened to her? It doesn't sound like it. And again, we end up scratching our heads wondering about him. Verse 31, they get the last words in all of this, Simeon and Levi. But they replied, should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? Probably what they mean by that is he came out trying to buy off his use of her as for a sexual toy. What a stark ending. This reminds me of the book of Jonah. You know, you read through the book of Jonah, you get the 4th chapter, and then bang, it's over, and you're thinking, wait a minute, there's a chapter missing in here. Is it in the next book? And occasionally, Jesus, with one of his parables, would do the same thing. Parable of the Good Samaritan. Go do likewise. Well, did they? Well, we don't know. And when a story has an unsettling end in the Bible, it forces us to have to think through the issues. And this one gives us a lot to think about. A lot to think about. Where's the obvious rejoinder? Why didn't Jacob answer them by saying, well, no, they shouldn't have treated your sister like a prostitute, but you shouldn't have killed a bunch of innocent people either. Why didn't he say that? The text doesn't tell us. Again, Jacob falls silent. We're troubled by Jacob in this text. There's no leadership in his family, and there's no witness in the community. My goodness, the people who did survive, those women and children who are now in bondage, what do they think about him? He's the one in charge of this family. And he's supposed to be a man of God? Deeply troubled. Deeply troubled. It reminds me of Adam. Adam in Genesis chapter 3. Remember Adam and Eve? And the apple and all that? Been there? And here's Eve out there making these profound, life-changing, spiritual decisions. And what does Adam say? Whatever you want, dear. That's my paraphrase. Actually, he's silent. He's silent. Where is Adam? Jacob's apparently a lot like Adam. Guys, when we look at this, one thing we need to do is ask ourselves, am I like Adam? Am I too much like Adam? Am I too passive in these kinds of things? Am I silent when I need to stand up and stop a bad situation from turning into something worse? Couldn't Jacob have stopped all of this? That's a good question. Did he know? The narrator drives us crazy in this, Brandy. She asks, did he know what they were doing? Well, it seems like when Hamor showed up, it says that he spoke to Jacob and the brothers, and then a conversation ensued, unless he got up and left the room. He heard that whole conversation. And he heard what they said that they were going to do. Did he believe? No. And there's a long list of unanswered questions in this text. The narrator, who is God, has chosen specific things to tell us about this text, and he's left us guessing about the rest of it. Why? There's a reason. There's a reason. It's a moral quandary, a lot of this stuff. Why Jacob's silence? Or was Jacob's silence smart? Some people actually think that Jacob was prudent in his silence. I'm not on that list. But here's the next question on your outline. Was Jacob's silence smart? Maybe, although I doubt it. Maybe, but he failed to be a spiritual leader. He failed to be a spiritual leader. There's no doubt about that. What else is missing? You know, a lot of things missing in this text. There's a lot of questions that we'd like to ask. We have to focus on what God has given us. But what else is missing in this text? What was that? God is missing. Now, he's missing in the text. There's no prayer, there's no worship, there's no mention of God. The closest we get is circumcision, and it's twisted. But there's no mention of God, of Yahweh, the Lord. There's no mention of altars, of sacrifices, of prayers. None of that. Now, is God absent? Absolutely not. God is always the main player in every narrative in the Bible. It's just that sometimes he recedes into the background and he's not mentioned, and that happens in this particular case. Why does that happen in this particular case? That's one of the questions. You know, in our culture, rape is wrong. And I'm pretty sure that the narrator wanted us to get that much out of this text, but there's more to it. Rape is wrong. But there's a lot more to it. The answer in our culture for rape is to help people have consensual sex. Is that the right answer? I don't think so. I already told you what my answer is. M&M, remember? I'm a proponent of that, so I'm bringing it up again. Modesty and what? Marriage. Modesty and marriage. Moms and dads, teach your daughters. Moms and dads, teach your sons. Marriage. Both of them. Modesty and marriage. And let them know you're going to be different from the world if you adopt this. Because the world is, yes means yes. We are modesty and marriage. You're going to be swimming upstream. Where was God in this tragedy? That's the last question. Let's write it down. Where was God in this tragedy? Neglected. He was neglected. And here's what I say, which assured moral confusion. There's a lot more that can go wrong when God is neglected. But one thing we know will happen is moral confusion. I don't know where the word, there it is, confusion. There we go. Do we live in a world that's morally confused? God is neglected. And we live in a morally confused world. When the world says that the answer to rape is yes means yes, we're confused. We're confused. And that's just one aspect. That's just one aspect. Why did Jacob neglect God? What a troubling question. You know, maybe you could go home and think about that and come up with an answer. Maybe Jacob neglected God because he didn't like what he thought God would do. Remember Jonah? We talked about him a minute ago. At the beginning of his account, God said, I want you to go talk to these Assyrians. I want you to go and preach to the Assyrians who were living east of him at the time in Nineveh. And he went which direction? West, the opposite direction. He said, hey, how are you going to do it? And when we read through that book and we get to the end, we realize that Jonah's problem was that he didn't want God to show mercy to the Assyrians. And he was afraid God might. He knew God well enough to know that if he went and preached to the Assyrians, who, by the way, were the ISIS of the ancient Near Eastern world. They were absolutely horrible. Everyone was scared to death of them. And the idea of going and preaching to them was just morally repugnant to him. The idea that God might show mercy on them, he just couldn't stand that. He hated them. He wanted them to be destroyed. It would be pretty much like God coming to you, Jack, and saying, Jack, I want you to go to Syria and preach to the people of ISIS. Now, Jack might decide, you know what? I am going to leave. I am going to get on a plane, but I'm going to Hawaii. I'm going the opposite direction. Now, I don't recommend you do that, Jack. You want to read the rest of Jonah before you find out. There's this thing about a fish and so forth, okay? Maybe Jacob didn't like what he saw happen here. You see, Jacob had a hard time with his father-in-law, Laban, and he left and tried to get away with him. And God forced him to reconcile with Laban. Forced him to. And then he reconciled with Esau. He's on a roll. There's two, and here comes another one. And he's thinking, you know, God in these situations tends to be a God of reconciliation. And I don't want to reconcile with these people. That's a tough possibility because it may open up a part of our hearts that we don't want to see. Sometimes people wrong us. Do we say, I don't want to reconcile with them. I don't want God to show them grace. I'm too angry. I don't know if that was Jacob's problem. There's another potential here. And there's more biblical basis for this one. And this one, too, is quite troubling. Jacob was tricked into marrying Leah. He thought she was ugly. He wanted to marry Rachel, her pretty sister. Of course, he ended up marrying both of them. And maybe he didn't like Leah's children as much as he liked Rachel's children. And Dinah was Leah's. Maybe he didn't care about her. Now, when we get into the stories about Joseph, here in just a few weeks, we're going to find out that, in fact, Jacob did show favoritism in his family. And it caused problems. However you slice this thing, Jacob is having trouble. But here's the good news to finish this up. We have to look at one more verse, or we're really going to end in a down place today, aren't we? Let's open the window and let some light in before we finish up. Can we do that? Chapter 35, verse 1. I know I didn't include it on the outline, but we need to read this to cleanse our souls from all this craziness today. Why is this story in the Bible? Verse 35, verse 1. Then God said to Jacob. Now, that's all we really need to read, because the good news is here that God was still willing to talk to Jacob. Amen? Even though he'd just been through an atrocious episode where he I think, did horribly. But God was still speaking with him. God is a God of grace and reconciliation. Go up to Bethel and settle there and build an altar there to God. God even still wants his worship. We might say, if we were in this community, if that's the kind of person God wants, then I don't want to have anything to do with God. You ever meet those people? But what we need to tell them when we run into those folks is, look, you don't understand how gracious, how patient, how kind, and how loving God really is. There's a day of judgment. There's a day of vindication. But up until that point, he's an incredibly forgiving, patient, kind, gracious God. And he is, even to Jacob. God didn't give up on Jacob. And he's not going to give up on us. I hope we never go this far down. I hope we never go this far down. But God won't give up on us. Would you bow your heads with me for just a moment?